22 years raising 3 little girls that nobody wanted, and now the state was calling him a thief. Don Eliseo Vargas closed his eyes. He had nothing left to fight with. The courtroom door creaked open, and 3 women stepped inside. The silence became deafening. The judge's gavel struck the bench, echoing through the courtroom like a stone dropped into a dry well. Don Eliseo Vargas, 78 years old, stood before the judge with his head slightly lowered. The orange prison uniform hung loosely from his shoulders. The handcuffs felt heavier than anyone could imagine for a man of his age. His hands were crossed in front of him. The knuckles were swollen from decades of hard labor, and a faded yellow stain marked the back of his left hand like a map of a country that no longer existed. Then one winter, while reviewing old financial records, Octavio discovered the real value of that trust. After 22 years of careful management and accumulated interest, the amount was far larger than he had imagined. And that was when the story began. The story that now filled the courtroom. The story that claimed Eliseo had manipulated a dying old man. That he had forged documents. That he had stolen money that never belonged to him. But the truth was different. The truth stood in handcuffs. Wearing orange. And saying nothing. "Mr. Vargas," the judge said, "your attorney has requested a postponement. Do you wish to make a statement before I consider the request?" Don Eliseo slowly lifted his head. It took him several seconds to speak. "No, Your Honor. You have nothing to declare." "No, sir. What must happen, will happen." The prosecutor exchanged a subtle glance with the judge. A look that seemed to say, "See? He isn't even defending himself." The public defender tried to argue. He spoke about Don Eliseo's age. His health. The lack of time to prepare a proper defense. But everyone in the courtroom already knew how this would end. The machinery of the state was already moving. Ready to crush an old man. As the lawyer continued pleading, Don Eliseo closed his eyes. For the first time that day, his face relaxed. Not from relief. From exhaustion. A lifetime of exhaustion. And his mind drifted back 22 years. To a cold dawn. To a tiny baby girl with nearly white blonde hair, abandoned on the steps of a neighborhood church. Wrapped in an old damp blanket. The baby wasn't crying. That was the saddest part. She had already learned not to cry. Tucked inside her patched dress was a folded note. It contained only one sentence. "Her name is Valentina. Please forgive me." Don Eliseo had been walking to work before sunrise when he found her. Without hesitation, he picked her up from the cold. Wrapped her inside his own jacket. Held her tiny body against his chest. And somehow knew that this child would change his life forever. As he walked 15 blocks home, he whispered softly to her sleeping face. "Don't be afraid, little one. You'll never be alone again. I promise you." Valentina was only the beginning. A year later, fate brought another child into Don Eliseo's life. She was 5 years old and sitting alone outside a public hospital. Her clothes were dirty, her face was covered with dust, and she clutched a broken doll missing one arm. "Where are your parents?" Don Eliseo asked gently. The little girl looked at him with large brown eyes. "My mother went away," she whispered. "Will she come back?" The child shook her head. She said she would. But that was 3 days ago. Her name was Camila. Hospital staff had already contacted social services, but the shelters were overcrowded and underfunded. Nobody seemed to know what would happen to her next. Don Eliseo visited her every day after work. He brought bread, milk, and small toys he could barely afford. After 2 weeks, he could no longer bear the thought of leaving her alone. The paperwork was difficult. The authorities questioned how a poor mechanic could possibly care for another child. But eventually, Camila came home with him. For the first time, little Valentina had a sister. The tiny house suddenly felt warmer. Laughter returned to rooms that had been silent for years. Then came Renata. She was 8 years old when Don Eliseo met her. A social worker found her sleeping inside an abandoned warehouse after both of her parents died in an accident. Unlike Valentina and Camila, Renata trusted nobody. She fought. She shouted. She stole food. She broke windows. She expected every adult to abandon her sooner or later. For months she refused to call Don Eliseo by his name. She simply called him old man. The neighbors often warned him. That girl is trouble. You should send her away. She'll ruin everything. But Don Eliseo never listened. Every night he placed an extra plate at the dinner table. Every morning he woke up before dawn to prepare breakfast. And every evening he sat beside her, even when she refused to speak. One winter night, Renata finally asked the question she had been hiding for months. Why are you doing this? Don Eliseo looked at her. Doing what? Taking care of me. The old mechanic smiled softly. Because someone should. Renata stared at him. No one ever stayed before. Don Eliseo reached across the table and gently placed his rough hand over hers. I'm not everyone else. For the first time since arriving, the girl cried. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just silent tears rolling down her cheeks. That night she stopped calling him old man. From then on, she called him Papa. Years passed. Money was always scarce. Don Eliseo worked long hours repairing engines and machinery. Sometimes he skipped meals so the girls could eat better. Sometimes he walked miles to work because he couldn't afford bus fare. But the girls never knew how difficult things truly were. Whenever they asked if everything was okay, he always gave the same answer. We have enough. The truth was that many nights he went to bed hungry. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. A black car stopped outside the workshop. A man stepped out wearing an expensive suit. It was Don Anselmo Mancilla, one of the wealthiest men in the region. He had known Eliseo for years. Not as an employee. As a friend. Anselmo had quietly watched the old mechanic raise 3 abandoned children with a devotion that many wealthy parents never showed their own families. That afternoon, the businessman visited the small house. He saw the girls studying around the kitchen table. He saw their worn schoolbooks. Their patched clothes. Their hopeful smiles. And he saw something else. A family built entirely from love. Before leaving, Anselmo stood beside the front gate and said, "You've done something extraordinary, Eliseo." The mechanic shrugged. "I only did what needed to be done." But Anselmo never forgot what he had seen. Years later, when illness began consuming his body, he made a decision that would change everything. A decision that eventually brought Don Eliseo to this courtroom. A decision that would create enemies powerful enough to destroy a man. And now, 22 years later, those enemies believed they had finally won. But outside the courthouse, 3 women were driving toward the city. 3 women whose lives had once been saved by a poor mechanic. 3 daughters who had no idea their father was about to lose everything. And when they learned the truth, nothing would stop them from coming home. The courtroom remained silent as the hearing continued. Don Eliseo stood motionless before the judge, looking more like a tired grandfather than a criminal accused of stealing a fortune. Across the room, Octavio Mancilla sat comfortably in his seat. Confidence radiated from him. Every document seemed to support his accusations. The evidence looked overwhelming. Bank records. Financial statements. Legal reports. Everything pointed toward one conclusion. Eliseo Vargas had controlled a trust fund worth millions. And now that money was gone. At least, that was the story the prosecution wanted everyone to believe. But 22 years earlier, the truth had begun very differently. When Don Anselmo Mansilla learned that his illness was terminal, he started putting his affairs in order. Doctors had given him little time. For the first time in his life, wealth no longer seemed important. What mattered was what he would leave behind. One afternoon he invited Eliseo to his mansion. The mechanic arrived wearing his work clothes, embarrassed by the grease stains on his hands. Anselmo laughed. "You've been my friend for 20 years. Stop acting like a guest." The two men sat together for hours. They talked about life. About regrets. About family. And eventually, about the three girls. "How are they doing?" Anselmo asked. Eliseo smiled immediately. "Valentina wants to become a lawyer. And Camila? A doctor." Anselmo chuckled. "And Renata?" The old mechanic laughed. "She changes her dream every week." For a moment, both men enjoyed the conversation. Then Anselmo became serious. "Promise me something." Eliseo looked at him. "What is it?" "If I die before they're grown, I want you to keep helping them." Eliseo frowned. "I'll do that anyway." "No," Anselmo replied softly. "I mean financially." The businessman opened a folder and pushed it across the table. Inside were legal documents. Trust agreements. Investment accounts. Property records. An amount so large that Eliseo immediately closed the folder. "No." Anselmo smiled. "You didn't even read it." "I don't need to. It's too much." "Exactly," Anselmo said. "That's why I trust you." The mechanic stared at him in disbelief. "There are lawyers, accountants, banks. And none of them would protect those girls the way you would." The room fell silent. Finally, Anselmo placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Eliseo, money is easy to find. Good people aren't." Several months later, Don Anselmo died. His will was read before family members, lawyers, and business associates. Most of the estate went to relatives, including Octavio. But a special section of the will created a trust dedicated exclusively to Valentina, Camila, and Renata. Eliseo was appointed trustee. The decision shocked everyone. Especially Octavio. At the time, however, he said nothing. The amount seemed relatively small compared to the rest of the inheritance. He simply signed the documents and moved on. Years passed. The girls grew older. Valentina excelled in school and eventually entered law school. Camila earned scholarships and pursued medicine. Renata developed a passion for writing and journalism. Every tuition payment. Every medical expense. Every textbook. Every apartment deposit. Every emergency. All came from the trust exactly as Don Anselmo intended. Eliseo kept meticulous records. Receipts. Invoices. Bank statements. Thousands of documents stored in boxes inside a small locked room. He never spent a single dollar on himself. Not one. Meanwhile, the trust investments continued growing. What remained became increasingly valuable over the years. Then Octavio discovered the numbers. And greed took control. He convinced himself that the trust should never have existed. That the money belonged to the Mansilla family. That Eliseo had somehow manipulated an old, dying man. Slowly, he began building a case. Investigators were hired. Lawyers were paid. Former employees were pressured into making statements. Rumors spread throughout the community. By the time charges were filed, public opinion had already turned against the old mechanic. And now, sitting in court, Octavio believed victory was certain. What he did not know was that 3 women had finally learned what was happening. Valentina received the news first. A former neighbor called her office. "Your father has been arrested." For several seconds she thought she had heard wrong. My father? Yes. Don Eliseo. The lawyer's face turned pale. Across the city, Camila received the same call while finishing a hospital shift. And hundreds of miles away, Renata saw the story appear on a news website. The headline struck her like lightning. Elderly man accused of stealing orphan's fortune. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Then she grabbed her phone. Within minutes, the three sisters were speaking together. And for the first time in years, they all felt the same thing. Fear. Not for themselves. For the man who had spent his entire life protecting them. Valentina broke the silence. We're going home. Camila didn't hesitate. I'm coming. Renata's voice trembled with anger. They think he has no family. A long pause followed. Then Valentina answered. They're about to find out how wrong they are. The next morning, the courthouse was even more crowded than before. News of the case had spread across the region. People gathered outside the building long before the hearing began. Inside, Don Eliseo sat quietly beside his attorney. He looked exhausted. The sleepless nights in jail had taken their toll. Yet he remained calm. As if he had already accepted whatever fate awaited him. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The proceedings resumed. Prosecutor Restrepo immediately continued presenting evidence. More documents. More accusations. More claims that the old mechanic had abused his position as trustee. Each statement pushed public opinion further against him. Then something unexpected happened. The courtroom doors opened. Every head turned. 3 women walked inside. Confident. Determined. And impossible to ignore. The first wore a navy blue suit and carried a briefcase. The second wore a doctor's coat over professional clothing. The third carried a folder filled with documents and press credentials hanging from her neck. Valentina. Camila. Renata. The 3 daughters Don Eliseo had raised. A wave of whispers swept through the room. The old mechanic slowly turned around. For a moment he thought he was dreaming. His eyes widened. Valentina smiled softly. Camila was already crying. Renata looked ready to start a war. Papa, she whispered. Don Eliseo's hands trembled. For the first time since his arrest, emotion appeared on his face. The judge struck his gavel. Order in the court. Valentina stepped forward. Your Honor, my name is Valentina Vargas. She placed her credentials on the table. I am an attorney licensed by this court. The room fell silent. The prosecutor frowned. Valentina continued. I am also one of the beneficiaries of the trust at the center of this case. That statement changed everything. The judge leaned forward. You wish to speak on behalf of the defense? Yes, Your Honor. And the other 2 women? Camila stepped forward. Dr. Camila Vargas. Renata followed. Renata Vargas. Investigative journalist. The spectators exchanged shocked looks. These were not helpless victims. These were successful professionals. Women who had built remarkable lives. The exact lives the trust fund had been created to support. Valentina looked directly at the judge. With respect, this case is built upon a false assumption. The prosecutor immediately objected. Your Honor. Sit down, Mr. Restrepo, the judge interrupted. I want to hear this. Valentina opened her briefcase. Inside were dozens of files. Receipts. Bank statements. Legal records. Education records. Medical bills. 22 years of documentation. All expenditures made by Mr. Vargas were authorized under the trust agreement. She placed several binders on the evidence table. Every dollar is accounted for. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. The prosecutor's confidence began to fade. Camila then stepped forward. My medical education was funded through that trust. She held up copies of university invoices. Every payment was legal. Renata followed. My journalism degree was funded the same way. Then she looked directly at Octavio. And we never received a single cent that wasn't authorized. Octavio's smile disappeared. For the first time, uncertainty appeared on his face. Valentina continued presenting evidence. Each document weakened the prosecution's argument. Each receipt destroyed another accusation. Each record confirmed the same fact. Eliseo Vargas had done exactly what Don Anselmo intended. Nothing more. Nothing less. The prosecutor attempted to recover. Even if the funds were spent on the girls, that doesn't prove Mr. Vargas didn't manipulate the original trust. Valentina nodded calmly. As a matter of fact, it does not. She paused. Which is why we brought additional evidence. The room became completely silent. She reached into her briefcase and removed an old envelope. The paper was yellow with age. The seal was still intact. Every eye followed her movements. What is that? The judge asked. Valentina looked toward Don Eliseo. The old mechanic stared at the envelope in shock. He recognized it immediately. He had never seen it opened. Not once. This, Valentina said quietly, is a personal letter written by Don Anselmo Mansilla shortly before his death. Even Octavio suddenly looked nervous. The judge adjusted his glasses. Proceed. Valentina carefully broke the seal. The paper unfolded slowly. The courtroom held its breath. Because whatever was written inside could change the entire case. And perhaps destroy the lies that had survived for more than 20 years. Valentina unfolded the fragile letter carefully. The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of the paper seemed loud. Judge Linares adjusted his glasses. Please read it. Valentina nodded. Her voice remained steady as she began reading. To whoever may one day question Eliseo Vargas. If you are reading this, it means I am no longer alive. I am writing these words of my own free will, with a clear mind and full understanding of my decisions. The trust one created for Valentina, Camila, and Renata was not suggested by Eliseo Vargas. It was my idea alone. A wave of whispers spread through the courtroom. Valentina continued. No man has shown greater integrity than Eliseo. For years I watched him sacrifice his comfort, his money, and even his health to raise 3 children who were not his own. If anyone deserves my trust, it is him. The prosecutor's face grew tense. Octavio shifted nervously in his seat. Valentina kept reading. To my family members, especially those who may someday challenge this decision. Understand this clearly. The money belongs to the girls. Not because they share my blood. But because they share my values. And because Eliseo taught them those values. The room fell silent once again. Even the journalists had stopped writing. Every person was listening. Valentina reached the final paragraphs. If anyone ever accuses Eliseo Vargas of dishonesty, know that such accusations are false. I selected him because he is the most honorable man I have ever known. Any attempt to remove the trust from his care should be considered an insult to my memory. Signed. Don Anselmo Mansilla. Valentina lowered the letter. For several seconds nobody spoke. The impact was overwhelming. The judge slowly leaned back in his chair. The prosecutor appeared stunned. And Octavio Mansilla looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath him. But Valentina wasn't finished. Your Honor, we have additional evidence. She handed the original letter to the court clerk. Then Renata stepped forward. I spent the last 24 hours investigating how this case was built. She opened a thick folder. Inside were copies of emails, financial records, and witness statements. What I found was disturbing. The judge frowned. Explain. Renata pointed toward Octavio. Several witnesses were pressured into giving misleading testimony. Gasps echoed throughout the courtroom. Some were former employees who admitted they were promised financial incentives. The prosecutor immediately objected. But Renata calmly produced signed affidavits. The judge reviewed them carefully. His expression darkened. Then Camila approached the witness stand. There is something else. She presented medical records. Records belonging to Don Anselmo. The documents confirmed that when the will and trust were created, Anselmo was mentally competent and fully capable of making legal decisions. The prosecution's entire theory depended on the idea that Anselmo had been manipulated. Now that argument was collapsing. Piece by piece. Fact by fact. Truth by truth. Finally, Valentina looked directly at the judge. My father never stole from anyone. Her voice cracked slightly. For 22 years he protected us. She turned toward Don Eliseo. The old man sat motionless, tears filling his eyes. We stand here today because of him. Camila stepped beside her. I became a doctor because of him. Renata joined them. I became a journalist because of him. Valentina continued. He never asked for recognition. He never asked for repayment. He never even told us how much he sacrificed. The courtroom was completely silent. Even the prosecutor seemed unable to respond. Then the judge spoke. Mr. Restrepo, does the prosecution wish to continue? For the first time since the trial began, the confident prosecutor hesitated. Because everyone in the room could see what was happening. The case was falling apart. And the final decision was now only hours away. But before the day ended, one more truth would emerge. A truth that would expose the real reason Octavio had brought the case in the first place. The courtroom remained silent after the daughters finished presenting their evidence. Every accusation against Don Eliseo Vargas had been answered. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. He was innocent. But one question remained. Why had Octavio Mansilla worked so hard to destroy him? Judge Linares turned toward the defense. Is there anything else you wish to present? Renata slowly stood. Yes, Your Honor. She walked to the evidence table and placed another folder before the judge. This file contains financial records from several companies owned by Octavio Mansilla. Octavio immediately rose from his seat. What does that have to do with this case? The judge raised a hand. Sit down, Mr. Mansilla. Reluctantly, Octavio obeyed. Renata continued. Over the last 5 years, Mr. Mansilla accumulated significant debts through failed investments and business losses. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. She opened the folder. These records show that shortly before filing this lawsuit, he attempted to secure loans using assets he did not legally own. The judge examined the documents. And those assets included the trust fund? Yes, Your Honor. A heavy silence filled the room. Suddenly everything made sense. The case had never been about justice. It had never been about protecting a family inheritance. It had been about money. Octavio believed that if he could remove Eliseo as trustee and invalidate the trust, he could gain control of the remaining assets. Greed had motivated everything. The false accusations. The investigation. The public humiliation. The arrest of an innocent old man. The prosecutor looked stunned. He had been given only part of the story. Even he appeared disturbed by what he was learning. Judge Linares spent several minutes reviewing the evidence. Then he removed his glasses. The entire courtroom waited. No one moved. No one spoke. Finally, the judge began reading his decision. After reviewing all evidence presented before this court, it is clear that Mr. Eliseo Vargas acted fully within the authority granted to him under the trust established by Don Anselmo Mansilla. Don Eliseo lowered his head. Valentina quietly grabbed Camila's hand. The court finds no evidence of theft, fraud, manipulation, or misuse of funds. A few people in the audience began to smile. The judge continued. All criminal charges against Mr. Vargas are hereby dismissed. The room erupted. Some people applauded. Others cheered. Several journalists rushed to write the breaking news. Tears filled Camila's eyes. Renata covered her mouth. Valentina simply closed her eyes in relief. But the judge was not finished. Furthermore, this court orders an immediate investigation into allegations of witness tampering, fraudulent testimony, and financial misconduct related to the filing of this case. His gaze settled on Octavio. The meaning was unmistakable. Octavio's face turned pale. For the first time, he looked truly afraid. The gavel struck. Court adjourned. It was over. 22 years of sacrifice. Months of accusations. Days of humiliation. And finally, the truth had won. As people began leaving the courtroom, Don Eliseo remained seated. He seemed unable to move. The weight he had carried for so long was finally gone. Then he felt three familiar arms wrap around him. Valentina. Camila. Renata. His daughters. The little girls he had once carried home from the cold. The children the world had abandoned. Now successful women. Now standing beside him. Now protecting him the way he had protected them. Papa, Camila whispered through tears. We're here. Don Eliseo smiled. A genuine smile. The first in a very long time. I know, he said softly. For a moment, none of them spoke. They simply held one another. Then Renata laughed through her tears. You know, the whole country is probably talking about you right now. The old mechanic chuckled. I'd rather go home. The three daughters laughed. And so they did. That evening they returned to the small house where everything had begun. The house was older now. The paint had faded. The furniture was worn. But it was still home. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, Don Eliseo sat quietly on the porch. His daughters sat beside him. The same way they had years ago. He looked at them and felt something no amount of money could ever buy. Peace. Because in the end, his greatest inheritance was never the trust fund. It was the family he had built through kindness, sacrifice, and unconditional love. And as he watched his daughters laughing together, he realized something beautiful. The world may forget wealth. The world may forget power. But it never forgets a person who chooses love when everyone else walks away.